Hey everyone. So 2 days ago, Israel's cabinet unanimously voted to formally recognize the Armenian genocide, something Israel had deliberately avoided doing for decades, specifically to protect its relationship with Turkey. And the fact that they're doing it now, while everything else with Erdogan is falling apart, basically tells you where this relationship actually stands. And we'll come back to that at the end, because it's a pretty perfect bookend to what I really want to talk about in this video. But this video, the idea for this video actually started with a conversation I had this morning. I ran into one of you, an audience member in my neighborhood, someone who watches this channel, and he asked me a great question. He said, why has Israel and Turkey's relationship basically collapsed over the last few years, over the last decade or so? And I said to him, look, to really understand that, you can't just look at the headlines from the last few years. You have to understand who Erdogan actually is, where he comes from, what he actually believes. So that's what we're going to do in this video. So that's the question we're going to deal with. How did Turkey-Israel relations get so bad? So let's start with Erdogan himself. His backstory, honestly, explains a lot more than people think. So Erdogan grew up in a poor religious neighborhood in Istanbul called Kasim Pasha, I think is the correct pronunciation. It's not exactly a fancy part of town, historically kind of a rough working class area. And as a kid, he was actually a really good soccer player, footballer, as you would say, if you're from the UK or elsewhere. He was really good. He was a striker, scored a lot of goals. And by all accounts, he had real talent and really wanted to go pro, and he was a very competitive player. But his father, who was a devout Muslim, his father was not into that, and his father was not happy with him being an athlete, and he used to beat him for playing. So eventually that ambition got knocked out of him. So he refocused on school, went to study economics in college, and during this period, his student years, he got pulled into the circles of religious and intellectual thinkers who were influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood style political Islam. Okay, that ideological foundation, which was formed pretty early in his life, has never really left him. And it's worth pausing on that for a moment, on that Muslim Brotherhood connection, because it's a whole worldview. The Muslim Brotherhood, going back to its founding in Egypt in the 1920s, looked at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the abolition of the Muslim caliphate that the Ottoman Empire represented, that the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood was just a couple years later in response to it, because they viewed the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the caliphate, as a catastrophe, as a moment that the Islamic world lost its political unity and its protector. And from the Muslim Brotherhood perspective, what happened in Turkey specifically was a betrayal. Kemal Ataturk, who brought Turkey into a secular, he wanted to modernize and secularize Turkey. He didn't just lose the Ottoman Empire. The Muslim Brotherhood saw it as taking the heart of that empire and forcibly secularizing it, which is true. He did forcibly secularize it. He banned religious courts. He closed religious schools. He changed the alphabet and the call to prayer at one point. I mean, it was very drastic measures were taken in Turkey to secularize and move away from Islamism. And to the thinkers of the Muslim Brotherhood, this was a wound that needed to be corrected. So the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood is to bring back the caliphate. And Turkey became ground zero for this. So you have to understand that Erdogan grew up in that ideological milieu, influenced by that thinking. And a lot of his trajectory in his career makes a lot more sense. He's not just a conservative politician who happens to be religious, who likes bashing Israel right now. He genuinely sees himself as reversing a historical tragedy, as undoing what Ataturk did and restoring Turkey to something like its Ottoman era role as the center of the Muslim world. So that's the lens for everything that follows: the Islamization at home in Turkey, the neo-Ottoman foreign policy and his statements to that effect, even the way he talks about Jerusalem and the Palestinian cause as things that he's personally here to defend. So in the 1990s, Erdogan becomes mayor of Istanbul. And credit where it's due, he was actually a very effective, hardworking mayor who was very popular. He won against all odds, beating the entrenched secular establishment parties. He beat them fair and square. And the people who worked with him at the time describe him as one of the most diligent mayors Istanbul ever had. He was, again, genuinely popular, not just with religious conservatives, but with regular people who noticed that the city was functioning better. He was effective. So he was a very popular mayor of the biggest city in Turkey. And this is also, interestingly, an era where Israel-Turkey relations were at their peak. They were at their warmest. If you talk to Israeli diplomats who were active back then, they'll tell you it was a real strategic partnership. There were joint military exercises. The Israeli Air Force trained in Turkish airspace. There was intelligence sharing, weapons sales. There was tourism, cultural exchanges, museum exhibits going back and forth. I mean, we had really good relations with Turkey, which is what my neighbor was asking me about this morning. And Erdogan himself, even as mayor, wasn't making waves on foreign policy. He had warm personal interactions with Israeli officials and with Turkey's Jewish community. No one was worried about Erdogan at that point. But then something happened in 1998. That's where things take a bit of a turn. Erdogan was at a political rally, and he recited a nationalist religious poem at this political rally. And he got charged with inciting religious hatred and actually did jail time for a few months. And under Turkish law at the time, a criminal conviction like this, according to Turkish law, if you have that criminal conviction, you are permanently barred from holding office. But instead of this ending his career, it became kind of like a martyrdom story. And he came out of prison even more popular than when he went in. His party then found a legal path around the restriction, and he was a more popular, a stronger political figure than ever before. And people who study Erdogan closely point to this period as the moment that his resentment towards Turkey's secular establishment, particularly the military, which has always positioned itself as the guardian of Turkish secularism, that this is the point where Erdogan's resentment towards them really hardened and became kind of more personal. That's what the people who study him tend to say. He then founded a political party in 2001 called the AKP, the Justice and Development Party. And the AKP combines conservative political Islam with economic reform messaging. And remember, he was a very popular, very successful, very effective mayor of Istanbul. And the AKP came into power in 2002. A lot of people saw what he did in Istanbul, and they said, hey, even if I'm not so Islamic, he's effective, he's a good leader. And the economic situation also, of course, helped. So he becomes prime minister in 2003. And from there, slowly but steadily, he starts reshaping Turkey, rolling back secular education policies, expanding religious influence in public life, curbing the power of the military and the courts. He basically was dismantling the institutional checks that kept Turkey secular ever since Ataturk, ever since the founding of the modern Turkish Republic. Now, here's the thing. Early on in power, during those early years, in the early 2000s, Erdogan was still pretty pragmatic towards Israel. He actually visited Israel in 2005, and he always talked about wanting to play a constructive role in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and peace efforts. There are accounts of warm, even friendly conversations with Israeli leaders during this stretch. So what we're seeing today, it wasn't just like an overnight flip, like, oh, Erdogan comes to power and now they're Muslim, now they're Islamic Muslim Brotherhood types. It was more of a kind of slow burn. The real turning point, which in retrospect is almost like it looks like a point of no return. That, I guess that's what a turning point is. The real turning point happens around 2008 and 2009. There was a war in Gaza that winter, and Erdogan then shows up at the World Economic Forum in Davos, and some of you might remember this incident. And he got into this heated exchange at Davos with Shimon Peres, where after Shimon Peres was talking about how we pulled out of Gaza and making Israel's case. It was supposed to be a debate. And Erdogan then started accusing Israel of killing babies and saying, you really know how to kill, and calling Israel murderers. And then he stormed off the stage and turned his back on Peres. He made a real demonstrative, dramatic exit. It was really, it was, in diplomatic terms, it was about as big an insult as you could deliver. You could find clips of it online. And up on the screen, I just put like a news story from the time. And here's what's important about that for the Erdogan story. That moment helped him a lot politically. It didn't hurt him at all. When he flew home to Istanbul, he was greeted with a hero's welcome. Look at this headline in Al Jazeera. Erdogan hailed after Davos walkout. Turkey PM returns to grand reception after clashing with Israeli president over Gaza. This is a headline from 2009, from January 2009. Okay, so that tells you a lot about what was happening in Turkey. He was greeted like a conquering sultan, right? He realized at that moment, probably, that being loudly and publicly anti-Israel was good politics, both inside Turkey and across the wider Muslim world. He was getting a lot of positive press for this. He found a signature issue that he could build more popularity from. And then in 2010, you get the big one, the big event in this whole story, the Mavi Marmara incident. Okay, this was a Turkish organized flotilla that tried to break through Israel's, tried to come into, Gaza through Israel's territorial waters. And it was a disaster of an event. It's worth knowing who actually organized it. A lot of people probably remember that. There were people who were killed. We'll get into it a little bit more in a moment. But it's worth remembering that the Mavi Marmara incident was organized by a Turkish NGO called IHH. And the IHH presents itself as an independent humanitarian charity, but in practice it's what's known as a GONGO, G-O-N-G-O, a government-organized and non-governmental organization, meaning that it operates with deep ties to and effectively the backing of Erdogan's own political apparatus. So it pretends to be non-governmental organization, but it's basically organized by the government. So this wasn't some grassroots activist flotilla. It was a state-adjacent event that had Erdogan's approval behind the scenes clearly. There's no way that the IHH could do something without Erdogan's approval because the way it's structured. And what happened there was Israeli commandos boarded the ship. Things got violent. They were violently confronted by activists on board who had prepared weapons. There was a resulting clash, and 10 Turkish citizens were killed. This was a genuine diplomatic crisis. Turkey pulled its ambassador from Israel. They downgraded diplomatic relations, and it took years of pressure, including a phone call brokered by the Obama administration, getting Israel to formally apologize and agree to pay compensation to the families in 2013. So this was a protracted problem that lasted a few years. And again, Israel ended up apologizing and paying compensation, which is just, this is a point that a lot of people don't fully understand when you think of it through a Western lens. In Western political culture, in Western culture, Judeo-Christian Western culture, whatever you want to call it, an apology is generally seen as something virtuous, a mature step towards reconciliation, right? You want to move past the conflict. But in the Middle Eastern context, in the broader Muslim political culture, an apology in a context like this, an apology from a rival power is read as a sign of submission and weakness. It's not virtuous. So when Israel apologized in 2013, hoping that it would close the chapter, the actual effect in Erdogan's worldview was closer to the opposite. It read as it was seen as a confirmation that pressure works, that Erdogan, had forced Israel to bend the knee. And by most accounts, and from what we see, it emboldened him rather than led to more reconciliation. Now, relations did patch up somewhat after that on the surface. And again, after rough patches in 2016, 2022, there were normalization pushes along the way. But it never, after the Mavi Marmara incident, things have never gone back to the old warm strategic partnership. And remember, Mavi Marmara is organized by IHH, which is an NGO that is organized by Erdogan's political apparatus, and that comes a year after. That comes a year after the incident at Davos with Shimon Peres. So that's the era where things really break down in a significant way. So quick detour, because I think it matters for understanding how unchallenged Erdogan eventually became in Turkey. In the summer of 2016, there was an actual attempted military coup against Erdogan. There were tanks in the streets of Istanbul and Ankara. There were fighter jets in the air. It collapsed within about a day, partly because regular citizens went out and physically stopped the tanks. But Erdogan used this failed coup as a cover for a massive purge. He arrested tens of thousands of people across the military, the judiciary, the civil service, basically gutting the one institution, the army, that had historically kept Turkey more secular, that kind of guarded Turkey's secular character. And remember that that's the same apparatus that had imprisoned Erdogan decades earlier. So his response to the coup, he used it as a pretense to just really purge all of these government institutions and the military of all of his enemies. A lot of people even suspected that the whole coup was really organized by Erdogan as a false flag to give him the cover to do this. But that's a separate issue that we're not getting into. But this happened in 2016. So after 2016, and since then, there's really nobody left in the Turkish leadership that's strong enough to push back on his agenda, including his agenda on Israel. Now, and remember, he also made reforms in the education system and media. So he's indoctrinating the population all these years. Now, through all of this, and this is really the key to understanding Erdogan, there's one consistent ideological thread. Wherever there's a religious Islamist political faction and a more secular or nationalist one in any Muslim majority context, Erdogan always sides with the Islamist faction, right? Like in the Somaliland thing, right? Where Somaliland is like moderate Muslims who want freedom and nationalism. And then in Somalia, where you have like jihadists, he backs Somalia, right? And it's all across the Middle East. So he's had a long, warm relationship with Hamas going back years. And that one actually makes even more sense because Hamas was originally founded as the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. When Sheikh Ahmed Yassin founded Hamas, that's what it was. It was the Muslim Brotherhood Gaza branch. So when Erdogan treats Hamas less like a terrorist organization and more like a sister movement, that's because he's from the same ideological family. It's not just a recent thing. He's from the same ideological roots as Hamas, which brings us to October 7th. Turkey did not condemn the Hamas attack. If anything, what the government really did was they essentially waited. They said nothing about it, and they waited for Israel's military response to start so they could fold into the broader anti-Israel messaging push, that Qatar was already driving, meaning that they could kind of, instead of condemning October 7th, they could just condemn the whole anti-Israel thing. And then they could throw in a few words about October 7th. That's what they did there. Erdogan's government has openly hosted senior Hamas leadership in Turkey for years. And after October 7th, his rhetoric escalated to a level we hadn't really seen before. Just a couple examples here on the screen. Turkish President Erdogan calls out West and Israel for Gaza massacre. This is October 28th, 2023. Israel had barely begun responding to October 7th, right? And then we have, this is a more recent one. Turkey calls for liberating Jerusalem. Okay, I mean, this is who the guy is. So he's really ramped up this anti-Israel rhetoric. He's talked about conquering Jerusalem. He's talking about praying to Allah to destroy Israel, comparing Netanyahu to Hitler. This is what he's been up to since October 7th. And in 2024, Turkey suspended trade with Israel entirely, the first real economic break in the relationship's history. And in November of that year, Erdogan was talking openly about severing diplomatic relations altogether. And I want to bring in the Qatar piece here. This is important. See, Turkey and Qatar have been functioning kind of like partners, like they're both ideologically and financially. And we see this diplomatically. They're often in tandem, like in this Iran war where you have the various Gulf states and Israel and America, and Turkey and Qatar are always kind of joined at the hip. And the way you have to look at it is that Turkey has the manpower and the infrastructure and the clout, and they're a NATO member and they have this big military, and Qatar is the money. And that's really, and also from the Muslim Brotherhood perspective, Qatar and Turkey are both led by people who are aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. And together, they've been pushing this pretty aggressive pro-Islamist line all across the region, including funding and amplifying anti-Israel messaging and sheltering Hamas leadership, etc. So Turkey's own economy has actually been in rough shape for years. High inflation, a weak currency, and Qatari money has helped cushion that, which gives Qatar significant influence over Turkey, okay? Because they're pumping money in there. So that's the Turkey-Qatar relationship. And then there's Syria, right? After Assad's regime fell, Turkey moved in and ended up with enormous influence over the new Syrian government. Ashara is basically a Turkish proxy, to the point where, a lot of security analysts just talk about the Turkish-backed Syrian government. That's the way we talk about it now, the same way that people used to talk about the Iranian-backed Lebanon because of Hezbollah's control over Lebanon. That's what Syria is becoming. It's kind of like a Turkish proxy. So Erdogan has essentially turned Turkey into a client state, and it's right on Israel's northern border. And that feeds right into his ambitions about Gaza and the Ottoman and Jerusalem that he's been saying. So there's been real friction over Turkish involvement here, and that's why in all the conversations about Gaza and about foreign troops coming in as part of the international stabilization force, Turkey was like all eager to bring their troops in, and Israel said no. Israel's pushed back against that because they know that once Erdogan's forces are on the ground, historically they don't leave. We see that all across the Middle East, like where they came in ostensibly to keep the peace or something in Libya, and they've just remained there. And elsewhere in the Middle East, there's Turkish troops on the ground in Somalia. There's Turkish groups on the ground There's Turkish troops on the ground all over the Middle East. Israel does not want them in Gaza. So things have only been escalating in 2025 and 2026. After Israeli forces intercepted another Gaza-bound flotilla a few months back, the Sumud flotilla, a Turkish court actually indicted Prime Minister Netanyahu and dozens of other senior Israeli officials, including the defense minister, because they intercepted this flotilla. And lo and behold, this flotilla was also organized by the IHH, the same Erdogan-linked gongo from the Mavi Marmara. So the IHH is the tool that Erdogan uses to attack. In fact, the IHH isn't just running flotillas; it's actively operating on the ground inside Hamas-controlled areas of Gaza right now. They've rebuilt a few mosques in Hamas-controlled areas. There's not supposed to be any reconstruction, but they're rebuilding mosques, and we know that mosques rebuilt by the IHH, run by Erdogan in Gaza, controlled by Hamas. I think we all get the picture of what Erdogan's doing there. He's entrenching his power into what's going on in the Gaza Strip, into the civil life in the Gaza Strip under Hamas as we speak. So Erdogan has referred to Netanyahu and his government as baby killers, as a massacre gang, and Israeli officials fire back. They call Erdogan a paper tiger. They accuse him of massacring his own Kurdish population. That's where the rhetoric is on both sides. And there's a real serious conversation going on in Israeli security and political circles right now about Turkey as the emerging strategic threat. When Israel made this alliance last year with Greece and Cyprus, it was really all about countering the Turkish threat in the region. And some experts, some former high-ranking officials have gone so far as to call Turkey the new Iran. Erdogan himself has even said publicly that Turkey could act against Israel the way it acted in Libya, which, to be clear, was a limited intervention, not a full invasion. So no one thinks that there's a direct war with Turkey around the corner. Excuse me. But the rhetoric has gotten there. And it just shows you how far the relationship has fallen. So the bottom line is this. If you're trying to understand why the Turkey-Israel relationship collapsed, it's not one single event. Even though the Davos incident with Peres and the Mavi Marmara were big events and they were important turning points and they get a lot of attention, but really this is like a 20-plus year arc of Erdogan, this one ideologically Islamist leader shaped by a worldview that sees the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the secular state of Turkey as a tragedy that needs to be corrected. And what he's doing is dismantling what used to be a transactional, secular, state-to-state relationship, and he's replacing it with this rivalry, positioning himself as the defender of the Muslim world, with Israel as the enemy. Now, this is as I said, this is very useful to him domestically when he needs people to rally around the flag because in a country where the economy, the currency is collapsing. It's also useful regionally where he's joined at the hip with Qatar, but sort of competing with them for supremacy of the jihadist side of the Sunni world. It also suits him to criticize Israel in his rivalry with Iran. And he also has a rivalry with Saudi Arabia for for leadership of the Muslim world, of the Sunni world. So he has these rivalries and relationships where being the attack dog against Israel and throwing his weight around against Israel actually helps him politically. And now he's got real power projection in Syria, and he's got these ambitions in Gaza where he's getting his tentacles in there through the IHH. So Erdogan is a real strategic problem for Israel. This isn't just like, a barking dog. And this is actually playing out in real time as we speak. Remember what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that 2 days ago, Israel's cabinet voted unanimously to formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Israel had specifically avoided doing that for decades, precisely because it would cause a crisis in Turkey-Israel relations. Right? Turkey is the direct successor state to the Ottoman Empire, the empire that carried out the Armenian genocide. So this isn't some abstract historical statement. It's Israel pointing directly at the wound that Erdogan has spent his whole political life trying to avenge. And Israel is poking their finger in his eye. And Turkey's response was immediate. They called it political. They accused Israel of using it to deflect from Gaza. Even Azerbaijan, Turkey's close ally and otherwise a friend of Israel's, publicly criticized the move. So that's how far Israel was willing to let this relationship go. And honestly, that tells you everything. You know, there's no relationship left to protect here. I think that's what the statement of the Israeli government about the Armenian genocide was really about. It was a way of saying, like, hey, we're done. The relationship that used to involve joint military exercises and Israeli tourists flooding Istanbul is gone, and both sides know it. Anyway, that's my take on the deterioration of Turkish-Israel relations in the era of Erdogan. Okay, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Be well. God bless.